All right, guys, welcome back to our study in the book of Daniel. Now, if you have not looked at the introduction that we did for the book of Daniel, go back and check that out because it helps us out to try to understand some of the times, the customs, and historical settings that are involved in the book. All right. So since we have not covered anything in Daniel, there's no need to do a background. So let's just immediately go into chapter 1. Now, chapter 1 is of some length, 21 verses. However, what we're going to try to do, all of chapter 1 in one video, since basically it has one mindset or one frame of thought that is trying to give concerning Daniel as well as his three friends in this wonderful introduction for the book. All right, so let's just start at verse number 1 and see if we can finish this without being too long. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Now, before I even go any further, let me just give a little background, and I mean just a little background, so that we can try to understand the historical settings of the book of Daniel, right? And of this particular case, and how that Daniel, as well as his three friends, ended up in Babylon in the first place. Principally speaking, God had already spoken to his people, that is, unto the Israelites, to obey. There were basically two covenants, and I cannot get into great detail in these things, but that was the Mosaic covenant, and we basically see that Exodus chapter, beginning in chapter 20, and we'll see all of those commandments that were involved in the Mosaic covenant. And then also too, and we saw that basically being established with the first generation of Israelites that came out of Egypt. So that's important, that Mosaic covenant, the covenant that bind the people of Israel to God in obedience. All right. And then there was also, we see in Deuteronomy, I believe it's chapters 28 and 29, the additional land covenant. And this is the covenant that is by virtue of Israel's obedience or their disobedience, they would either enjoy the land or ultimately be thrown off the land. And that's the idea of the land covenant. But all of these things were predicated upon their obedience. And we understand that Israel was broken into two, and we're not going to get into all of that. But because of the sin of Solomon, under his particular son, Rehoboam, the land was split. And that's when you get the North Israel, and then Israel, Samaria, also sometimes called Ephraim. And then there was the South, Judah, or sometimes in reference to Jerusalem. Okay. And Israel, the North, never had a good king, and Israel, the North, therefore went into exile much quicker, that is by Assyria, that is in 722 BC. And so therefore the north of Israel was dispersed because of their disobedience to the covenant of God. Remember, as God was bringing Israel into the land, the promised land, which was filled with Canaanites, it was the continual warning of God: don't imitate the Canaanites. Do not marry the Canaanites. Don't worship the gods of the Canaanites, and don't get involved in the practices of the Canaanites. For in doing so, they would come under the discipline of God. And if they continued in their disobedience, just like the Canaanites were thrown off the land, the Israelites would ultimately be thrown off the land. However, although they would not, and this is the point that I was talking about, the land covenant of Deuteronomy, 28 and 29, I do believe it is. But with respect to the land covenant, although Israel wouldn't be ejected from the land, God would eject them from the land, and they would not enjoy the blessings and benefits of the covenant, the land still remained their land. So that's important to understand as well. But anyway, So Israel, the north, thrown out, but Judah, the south, had a few good kings, and therefore they were allowed to remain on the land just a little bit longer. But nevertheless, Judah, like Israel, the north, still continued in her idolatry and disobedience to the Mosaic covenant and were ultimately thrown off the land. And so this is basically what we see happening here. So in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. So now let's get to that particular historical moment. Now we understand the reason why this is happening, because of their failure to be obedient to God and the Mosaic covenant dispelled from the land. Now we come to this point. Okay, Jehoiakim. So it was basically after the time that Egypt, there was Josiah, king of Judah. And he himself, very young king, went against Egypt. All right. And whatever the particular idea that Josiah had in mind, it was basically to try to solidify Israel's independence of the Gentile nations. That's basically his mind. There was the problem with Assyria, and now we got this growing problem with Babylon, but also too the problem of Egypt. All right. But the true problem was the Babylonians. But nevertheless, in the battle that he had with the Egyptians, that is Josiah, he was actually killed. I think it was about 31 years of age. His son took the throne, and that is Egypt, because it was a very common thing for the nations who would subjugate other nations, Egypt subjugating Jerusalem at this time, to put a king upon the throne, Jehoahaz. But anyway, Jehoahaz ended up being taken by Pharaoh Necho and brought back into Egypt, where he ultimately died. And it was Eliakim, who is this Jehoiakim right here, Eliakim, who was then placed upon the throne. But at the same time, Egypt itself was destroyed, well, basically itself subjugated. I think it was the Battle of Carchemish by the Babylonians. And now we have the Babylonians themselves subjugating Judah, that is Jerusalem. And this happened during the time of Jehoiakim. And as Nebuchadnezzar entered into Jerusalem at this time to subjugate it, he took some of the royal family and also of the house of God. He took some of the valuable things of the house of God. And this is where we start in the book of Daniel. So this happened roughly around the time of 605 BC, during the reign of Jehoiakim, when Nebuchadnezzar. Now, let me say a few things about Nebuchadnezzar too. Even though here Daniel calls Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon, that's true. That is true. He is the king of Babylon. But the point what happened is, it was his father Nabopolassar who was the king of Babylon at that time, when Nebuchadnezzar had besieged Judah at this particular time. You follow me? And while Nebuchadnezzar was besieging Jerusalem, word came from Babylon that his father Nabopolassar had died. And so Nebuchadnezzar quickly returned back to Babylon to get the throne, to be enthroned as the king. And so then, therefore, these Nebuchadnezzar here is referred to as the king of Babylon here. Okay, so in understanding all of these historical events, we want to put the picture together so that you can get it. So Nebuchadnezzar besieging Jerusalem, and then having subjugated Jerusalem, what does he do? He returned, verse number two, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. Okay, what is so important to understand, the Lord gave Jehoiakim into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. That is, just recall the things that I was saying to you earlier. The Mosaic law, Israel was under commandment to keep, they were covenant to God, to keep the law of Moses. However, if they disobeyed, they would be subject to God's discipline. And one of the ways that God would discipline the nation is allow other nations to subjugate them, and even ultimately, which Nebuchadnezzar would do, to exile them from the land. And this happened with Babylon's destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. But the point is, all of these things are happening by the providential hand of God. It is God who gave Jerusalem up to Nebuchadnezzar. And along in that subjugation, he took, as we said earlier, some of the vessels of the house of God. Now, this would come into play later on. We're going to see that too with his grandson in that act of the handwriting on the wall, but we won't be premature. But nevertheless, some of the vessels of the house of God, that is the temple in Jerusalem, and he brought them to the land of Shinar. Now, I don't want to get into that, but it is so interesting how that Babylon here is referred to by that ancient name Shinar. And we see this early in Genesis chapter 10. Remember, in Genesis chapter 10, Nimrod, who was one of the world's first conquering leaders, was in the ancient plain of Shinar. So this is that same area that we understand as Babylon. And there is that sense of, okay, I don't want to get into all of that. But the point that we can see is ancient Babylon, Shinar. To the house of his God. Now, to the house of his God could be to the house of his gods, right? Could be plural, or it could be a reference to the house of Baal or Marduk, the principal god of Nebuchadnezzar. And he brought those vessels also into the treasury of his God. Verse 3. So now, before we get into verse 3, we have the historical settings of the events that brought Daniel and his 3 friends into the land of Babylon in order for the events of Daniel to take place. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youths in whom was no defect, who were good looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, who had ability for serving in the king's court. And he ordered him to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. The king appointed for them a daily ration from the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank, and appointed that they should be educated for 3 years. And at the end of that period, end of which they were to enter the king's personal service. Now among them from the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. Then the commander of the officials assigned new names to them. And to Daniel he assigned the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. All right, let's talk about it. So now we get into Daniel and his 3 friends. So the king ordered Ashpenaz, and we don't see that name too often, but basically he was, as it is said, the chief of the officials. And what he would do is he brought in some of the royal family. You see, that's why we understand that Daniel was most likely relation to the royal family. Young men of the royal family. And also to notice they were intelligent, they were good looking, and they had the ability to be able, and this is the mindset of Nebuchadnezzar, to be able to serve in the court of the king. Now, whether or not, and it does not appear, but the possibility still does exist, whether or not Nebuchadnezzar would use them in some sort of official capacity representing Babylon to the Israelite people, say for instance, back in Judah, that does not seem to be the case, but that possibility does exist, and it was a common practice of the king. That is to take, it is always, people can receive it better when they are being ruled over people of their own kind. So what these kings would do, the conquering kings would do, they would take people from their own kind, take other Israelites, and then try to conform those Israelites to certain Babylonian beliefs, Babylonian establishment, and Babylonian loyalties, and then take these people, place them back into their societies to function as intermediaries or rulers on behalf of Babylon. So that is a possibility. But the idea here principally suggests that these men were to stand as counselors for the king in the court of the king, that is, for Nebuchadnezzar himself. All right, so let's go back here. I don't want to get too much into that. So what we have is the official Ashpenaz taking some of these young men. Among some of these young men, notice some of these young men from Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. I kind of said their name in a different type of order, but these 4 Hebrew men. Now, they were not all of the Jewish men that stood here, but they were the notable ones to whom God would use. All right. And so what happened? Verse number 4, they were to be educated. And this is important too. They had a 3-year rigorous education in the courts of Babylon to learn the literature, the wisdom, and all the things of the Babylonians. And this would also include, as we'll see later on too with Daniel, astrology and other things concerning education in the Babylonian system. They were also given a portion of what they call the king's food. Now that is, remember, they are in Babylon, no longer in Israel. The king's food, they would eat. These would be delicacies. This would be good food. However, the things, and we'll see this later on in the text, the food of these Gentiles prepared by the Gentiles would not be foods permitted under the Mosaic law for the Jews to eat. And later on, this would become problematic for Daniel and his 3 friends. All right. But nevertheless, the king, he treated them very well. And that's the whole point about it. Giving them a portion of his food and preparing them for this training. Verse number 6 now talks about the Daniel and his 3 friends. One of the things that we can see when we look at the particular names of Daniel's friend, the names, this is what I want to point out. By looking at the names, it gives some sense of inference of Daniel's and his 3 friends, of their parents, that they were God-fearing people, because all of the names of Daniel and his 3 friends have some sense of a reference to God. Daniel's name, which is God is judge. Hananiah, I believe, is God is gracious. Mishael, who or what is God, and Azariah, Yahweh helps. Now, what you can see when you look at that, notice in the name, let me just help you out with this part too. In Daniel, the El, which is in Hebrew God, and in Hananiah, the Ayah, also is Yahweh. It's a shortened form of Yahweh. And in Mishael, you can see the El with reference to God, and Azariah, Yah, which is a shortened form of Yahweh. So what we can see as we look at the particular names is the reference to God. This is important, the reference to the God of Israel. And notice what we see in the commander, that is, in the commander of the officials in verse number 7. He gave them new names. So what we basically see, he's trying to eradicate anything that has to do with Israel's gods, and also to bring them fully into the mindset and the customs of the Babylonians. And so he's trying to make them Babylonians. All right. And this is so important too, especially when we come to the end of Daniel, as we see, in a sense, even though Daniel and his 3 friends will serve loyally the Babylonians, they will not allow the eradication of their gods. They will not forget their true God. But anyway, so what does the commander do? Verse number 7, he gave them new names, and the names that he gave them were names after the gods of the Babylonians, trying to make the Jewish young men forget the names, forget their relationship to their God, their allegiance to their God, their allegiance to their people, and reassign their allegiances to the Babylonians. And so he gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, which is a little strange, but it means lady protect the king. And to Hananiah, he gave the name Shadrach, which means I am fearful, like I am fearful of a god, that is, one of the Babylonians' god. To Mishael, he gave something similar in sound, Meshach. And Meshach is like, I am despised or humbled before the gods. and Azariah, he gave the name Abednego, which literally means a servant of Nebo, But anyway, so what we basically see, verses 1 through 7, is the coming of Daniel and his 3 friends into Babylonians, because Nebuchadnezzar made an incursion into Judah around 605 BC. During this particular time, he chose certain young men of the family, of the royal family of Judah, for the particular purpose that they may serve the Babylonians, that they may serve Nebuchadnezzar in a royal capacity, to counsel him and to serve at his pleasure, whatever the pleasure is. So in preparing them for this service, he treated them well, giving them a portion of the king's food. But this would be problematic because these are Gentiles, and a lot of the foods that we'll be eating would be considered by Levitical law unclean. But nevertheless, he did that. And also, too, there was a reassignment of the names to reprogram them in accordance to the Babylonian culture and the mindset. All right. Verse number 8. This part should basically be like a story and should go pretty easy. But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials, and the commander of the officials said to Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has appointed your food and your drink. For why should he see your faces looking more haggard than the youths who are your own age? Then you would make me forfeit my head to the king. So let's stop. Remember, we talked about that part about that portion of food that was allocated by the king to Daniel and his 3 friends. Again, what about that food? It would be considered Levitical, unclean food. So Daniel made up his mind that he would not eat the king's food. So what is important here to see is even though Daniel had been taken from Judah and now he is in a foreign land, Daniel was still loyal to his God. And that becomes a key point that we want to see here that will be expressed at the end of this chapter. Daniel refuses to forget who he is and where he comes from. He is a Jew. And not only is he a Jew, but his God is Yahweh. And therefore he refuses to dishonor his God, and he refuses the king's choice food. This is the defiling of himself. Then verse number 9, what? God granted Daniel favor and compassion. Okay, this is another miniature theme that we see in the book of Daniel. Even though the Jews themselves are in a foreign land and under discipline by God, God still grants them favor in a foreign land, especially favor if they would be obedient to God. So what? We see with Daniel, God granting him favor in the sight of this official who is responsible for his education and his overall well-being, so that when he gets ready at the end of 3 years to come up before the king, he needs to look just like the rest of them. Okay. So, but nevertheless, God gave him favor, Daniel, and compassion in the sight of this man. Now, what we find is at first, the commander, this Ashpenaz, he didn't want to grant Daniel's wish. That is, Daniel did not want to eat of the king's choice food. He didn't want to grant that wish because he was afraid. Why? As we'll see later on, Nebuchadnezzar kind of was like an unstable kind of a man. He said, "You endanger my head to the king." If somehow the king looks at you and see that you look different, you look haggard in comparison to the rest of your companions, he's going to blame me because that was my responsibility, and I'm not going to get my head cut off because of that. But nevertheless, remember, God gave favor. So it seemed that the answer was kind of like a no at first until, let's keep reading, verse number 11. But Daniel said to the overseer, whom the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be observed in your presence and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food, and deal with your servants according to what you see." So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. And so now what we see is this, what verse number 11 says. Remember, Ashpenaz, the commander, says, "No, that doesn't sound like a good idea. You will get my head chopped off." But there was a man who was more intimate than it, that is, the overseer, verse 11, whom the commander of the officials appointed over Daniel. So it was his hand to actually do those things. He was responsible for it. You know, see what I mean? And so Daniel made an appeal to this particular one. So you got the commander who is over everything, and then under him, this particular overseer who is taking care of Daniel and his three friends to see that these things are done. Daniel says to him, he proposes, "Okay, I tell you what, give us just vegetables," because under the law, there was nothing wrong with eating vegetables. They didn't defile you. It was not considered to be unclean. "Give us vegetables and let us just drink water for 10 days and see how we look. If we look as well or even better than the others, then fine. But however, of course, the idea would be if we didn't, then we would have to eat the king's choice food." But remember now, this overseer had to do this. Remember what it said earlier. God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander. So therefore, the overseer had to take Daniel's suggestion to the commander, and he said, "Fine, let them do the test. And if they pass this particular test, then we can let them eat of this particular food that they want to eat so they won't defile themselves." So let's continue. But also, too, what we can see is the faith of Daniel. The faith of Daniel, that God indeed would make their appearance to be just as healthy or even healthier than the other men, other youths who ate the choice food from the king. All right. Verse 15. At the end of 10 days, their appearance seemed better, and they were fatter than all the youths who had been eating the king's choice food. So the overseer continued to withhold their choice food and the wine they were to drink, and kept giving them vegetables. So in the end, God, okay, it's not quite all the way over with yet, but we can call this kind of like in the interim. That is, after the 10 days of testing, it was indeed a blessing from God that even though they didn't have the king's choice food and all of that, eating only the vegetables, not drinking any of the wine too, because remember, the Jews would dilute their wine a lot and the Babylonians did not. But anyway, so they didn't defile themselves, and God blessed them, and God favored them by making them healthier in appearance than the others who were actually eating of the king's food. And the idea is defiling themselves too. 17. As for these 4 youths, God gave them, and that's important to see. Remember, one of the whole point, God is, even though the people of Israel are under divine discipline in a foreign land, if you are obedient to God, God will bless you. God will favor you. And this is what we continue to see. Verse 17, continuing, God gave them, that is, these 4 young men, knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. And so again, we see what? We see the reward of God to their loyalty to him, and God giving them the intelligence. Remember the whole point, they are in a special education program, and this is a hyper education program because the Akkadian language of the Babylonians was difficult enough. The literature and all forms of wisdom. And so what we see is a supernatural blessing of intelligence that God had given these 4 Jewish men. And even in particular concerning Daniel, he understood what? All kinds of visions and dreams. And this will become very important as we move through the book of Daniel as it relates especially to Nebuchadnezzar. 18. Then at the end of the days which the king had specified for presenting them, the commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and out of them all, not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. So they entered the king's personal service. As for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers who were in all his realm. And Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king. All right. So at the end of the 3-year period that Nebuchadnezzar had appointed for all of those young men to be educated in the matters of Babylon, in literature and wisdom and all forms of things that should be educated to conform these men to that Babylonian type of mindset, to prepare them to function for the king. At the end of that 3 years, they stood before the king, and the king tested them. And Daniel and his 3 friends proved to be better than all of the other magicians. And that is verse number 20. 10 times better than the magicians and conjurers. And these men basically were the counselors of the king of Babylon. And there were a number of men, the soothsayers, the magicians, the counselors, the learned men. All of these men functioned as counselors to the king of Babylon. So in their testing, as they stood before, that is Daniel, Mishael, Hananiah, and Azariah, as they stood before the king, he tested them to find that there were no others like them in all of his kingdom. And the reason why they had these extraordinary abilities, verse number 17, God gave them knowledge. And so he found them to be better than any of the rest and allowed them to come into what his counselors would be, to end up setting them over Babylon. That's what the end would be. They would end up being set over Babylon later on, but they would become a part of his counselors. And then it says at the end of verse 21, Daniel continued to the time of Cyrus, King Cyrus. This was basically around 539 BC. Okay, this was the end of Babylon. Then I don't want to get into all of that too, but then you would have the Medo-Persians come in, and then with the Medo-Persians after that, we would have Cyrus the Great, and it would be this Cyrus who would allow the Jews to go back and rebuild the temple. All right. So this would be the end of the 70 years of exile that God has spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. Right. So what do we have here? In chapter 1, we basically have the introduction of Daniel and his 3 friends, how they came into Babylon, how they were intended to be used by Nebuchadnezzar in his service, but they were to be loyal to the Babylonians. And what we see them eating the Babylonian food, no doubt they would be wearing of course, the clothing that would be given by the Babylonian. They would be trained in the literature and the writings of the Babylonians. And then ultimately they were given Babylonian names. And so we can see how this would be somewhat of an eradication of their Jewish heritage, and especially of their Jewish God. Remember, the names that they all had were names that referenced their Jewish gods. But what they did, he changed their names into the names for the Babylonian gods. But nevertheless, Daniel and his 3 friends remained loyal. Even though they were in a foreign land, they were still loyal to their gods. And Daniel and his 3 friends refused the foods that would defile them and put a test to the commander, even the overseer who was over them. Give us 10 days of testing. If we look fairer, then allow us to eat this food. God blessed, God favored, and we can see that too as that theme again, favored Daniel and his 3 friends, and their appearance was even better than those who ate the choicest food. Then we can see further evidence God favored them. He blessed them to be very intellectual men. They were better than any of the magicians or the conjurers or other counselors of Babylon, and therefore were allowed to continue in the service of Nebuchadnezzar. And Daniel was unique, for God gave him interpretation of visions and dreams. And then we see at the very end of the chapter how Daniel was allowed to continue up until the time of Cyrus, 539 BC. Some believing that Daniel would have been about 85 years of age at this particular time. All right. Thank you guys so much for joining me with that. Join me next time as we get into the nitty-gritty of Daniel in chapter 2 as we deal with the opening of the king's dream and Daniel's interpretation for those dreams. All right. See you next time.